Now let's stick to functions for the moment. And let's add another function here in this functions.js file. This is a function which I'll name SumUp. And the idea is that this function takes a list of numbers and adds them all together. Now for this, of course, we could accept multiple numbers as parameters, like num1, num2, and num3. And then we could return num1 plus num2 plus num3. This would work, but this function has one important limitation. It only accepts 3 numbers. And actually it wants exactly 3 numbers. We can't call this function with 2 numbers only. If I would do that, and I then console log the result of doing that, if I call this function with just the numbers 1 and 2 instead of 3 numbers, then you will see that if we execute this file, we get this NaN value down there. NaN is a special value in JavaScript, just like undefined is a special value, which is built into JavaScript and stands for not a number. And we get that because I'm only passing in 2 values here when 3 values are expected. Now, what did you learn about parameters that don't receive a value? They have undefined as a default value. So when we then add all those numbers together, the third number here actually will have no special value. Instead, it will be undefined. And if you add undefined, this special value that's known by JavaScript, to some numbers, JavaScript can't do this in a mathematical way because undefined is not a number, and hence you get this not a number result because JavaScript is not able to derive a number. Now we could solve this with some default value like 0, in which case we could execute this code and we now get 3 as a result here because now num3 will be 0 if it's not set. But still, this function is not really flexible because it needs at least 2 arguments, 2 parameter values to work correctly, and at most 3. Now, what if your goal would be to make that function work with any amount of numbers? Now, for that, we could rewrite it and not accept a couple of separate parameter values, but instead we could accept an array of numbers so that we call SumUp with an array as a value, here created with the square brackets, where we can have as many numbers as we want. And then we could rewrite the logic here in this function to create a helper variable result, and then loop through all the numbers here as we learned it with for off, and simply add the numbers to result, maybe here with this shortcut operator, which is just a short form for saying result plus number, like this. And then we return result in the end here. We could write it like this, and if we do that, and we then execute this file, I get 27 as a result here, which is the correct result. And that would be a fine way of writing such a function. But JavaScript also gives you another way of writing functions that take multiple values instead of just 1 or 2 values that you can use in situations where you don't have an array to pass to this function and where you don't want to create one just to be able to call this function correctly. Which might sound a bit abstract, but the more complex your JavaScript programs get, the more kind of cases you'll encounter in those programs. And it's not unrealistic that you might have some place in a program where you want to call a function with a couple of parameters, and you don't want to wrap those parameters into an array first, just to be able to call that function. Instead, you might want to prefer to be able to call this function like this, with just a list of numbers, a list of parameter values instead of one parameter value that's an array. And you want to be able to call this function with 4 values or 5 values or even 6 values. You want that flexibility. And JavaScript gives you that flexibility with another feature that's called REST parameters or REST arguments. In your function definition here, you can add 3 dots in front of your parameter name. That is a special operator built into JavaScript, which might look a bit weird and which we actually will see again later in a different context. But if you use it here in the parameter list of a function definition, then this operator says that this function accepts any amount of parameters, 1 parameter, 2, 3, 5, there is no fixed limit, and that all those parameters, which are passed in separated by a comma, will then be merged into an array behind the scenes by JavaScript. Hence, numbers inside of this function will still be an array, but we don't need to provide a finished array as a parameter value to SumUp. Instead, we can pass a comma-separated list, and thanks to these 3 dots, that will be wrapped into an array by JavaScript under the hood. Hence, with that, we can now adjust the code to look like this. And if I then execute this file, I get a valid result here because of this REST parameters feature here. Again, it's simply an alternative. We could have wrapped that list of values into an array ourselves and then just accept that one array value. But it's good to have that extra flexibility where you can write functions that take a dynamic amount of values so that you don't need to necessarily wrap your values into an array on your own first. Now, related to this REST parameters feature here and to this 3 dots operator, we also have another place where we can use this operator to basically do the opposite of what it does here. For that, keep in mind that here in this function definition, when using the 3 dots operator in this parameter list, it will merge a list of individual values together into an array. Now, let's say in the program which we have some data source, maybe some database, where we get some input numbers as an array. So here I have the number list again, but now again merged into an array. And then we have the SumUp function, which is written like this, and it explicitly wants a list of values, a list of parameters, instead of a single value. So SumUp here doesn't want an array. If I pass my input numbers array into SumUp nonetheless, you will note that if we execute this file, we get an unexpected result here. It's not adding these numbers mathematically. And the reason for that is that SumUp is written such that it wants a list of values, but it gets a single value which holds an array. And JavaScript does not check if that is an array, and it should then maybe split that up into a list of values. Instead, it expects a list of values and it doesn't get one, hence you get an unexpected result. Now, what you need to do here, if you have such a SumUp function that wants a list of values instead of a single array, is you need to convert that array back into a list of single values. Now, of course, you could say, why don't we just write the function such that we do want a single array value like this? And the answer would be yes, of course. For this dummy example, that would be the easiest solution. But in more complex applications and programs, which you inevitably will see at some point as a developer, you will simply sometimes have functions that are not written in the way that you can directly use them like this, because you might be using them in different places of your code, and in every place you might get different kinds of input values. So you very well might have a function that wants a list of numbers, even though in this exact scenario here, you have a single array of numbers. And therefore, to easily then convert such an array of numbers to a list of numbers, you also can use the three dots again, but now not in the function definition parameter list, but instead in the place where such a list of numbers is expected. So here, when I call SumUp and I'm passing in the concrete values that should be passed and provided to that function. Here, in such a place, where you're not in a function definition, but instead in a place where concrete values are needed, the three dots here are known as the so-called spread operator, because you spread an array out into multiple individual values. You pull out all the values in that array and provide them as standalone values to SumUp. That's what the three dots do in this place. It removes the square brackets, if you want to say it like that. And hence, if you now save this and you then execute this file again here, then you again get the expected number as a result, because now a list of individual numbers is passed in. And I am fully aware that this is a bit more advanced and can be tricky to wrap your head around if you only see a simple example like this one. But the idea of the simple example, of course, is to show you how these operators, these three dots, work. We'll see them again in certain parts of this course, and that's why I wanted to introduce them early so that you know how these operators work when you see them later again. For the moment, that's it about these operators though, but the rest, parameters, and the spread operator, these are features you should keep in mind.